Nicole Adams didn't expect her first day in the bustling marketplace to feel like walking into a den of secrets. The looks she received weren't just suspicious, they were accusing, as if the people here knew she wasn't who she claimed to be. But something far more dangerous was lurking beneath the surface, and it was her job to find it before it swallowed anyone else whole. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Nicole Adams stepped into the marketplace like an outsider entering a secret world. The sun had barely risen, and vendors were already setting up their stalls, preparing for another busy day. The marketplace was alive with the scent of fresh produce, the clinking of metal, and the distant hum of early morning conversations. This place was both a sanctuary and a battleground for those who had made their living here for decades. But for Nicole, it was a mission, one with higher stakes than anyone around her could imagine. The cover story was simple. Nicole, a small-time vendor, selling handmade jewelry she claimed to have made herself. It gave her the perfect excuse to blend in, while quietly observing the marketplace's every move. Her target was not the merchants, but a mysterious network operating under the surface. Vulnerable individuals had been disappearing, their last known connection being some vendor or transaction in this very market. Nicole's job was to get close to the suspects without raising any alarms, and that meant fitting into a place that didn't want her. The market was an insular community. Nicole could feel the weight of eyes on her back as she set up her stall for the first time. Every vendor had their own space, their own role, and their own set of unspoken rules. From the moment she laid out her first necklace, she could sense the skepticism. Conversations shifted into murmurs when she walked past. People didn't make eye contact with her unless it was to size her up. She had been trained to handle this. She was no stranger to prejudice, having faced it in various forms throughout her career. But it was different here. The market wasn't just a place of business, it was a fortress, and she was the intruder. Her first real encounter came when an elderly woman approached her stall, peering over her glasses at the jewelry. "You make these?" the woman asked, her voice sharp, laced with suspicion. Nicole smiled, keeping her cover story tight. "Yes, all handmade. I work with metals and beads, crafting each piece by hand." The woman didn't respond, but the look she gave spoke volumes. She didn't believe Nicole, and her unspoken judgment was clear. Nicole didn't belong here. As the morning went on, Nicole spotted someone else watching her. A tall, stocky man in his 40s, standing across the market with his arms crossed. His name, she would later learn, was Thomas, a vendor who had been part of the market community for over 20 years. His stall sold hand-carved wooden figures, intricate in detail, the kind of craftsmanship that took a lifetime to perfect. He didn't approach her, but his gaze never wavered. Unlike the others, his skepticism wasn't just born from her being an outsider. There was something deeper, more personal. Nicole felt the heat of his stare but didn't let it rattle her. If anything, it told her she was already starting to get noticed. By mid-afternoon, the market was bustling with customers, yet Nicole had made only a few small sales. Most people gave her a wide berth, sticking to the familiar vendors they knew. But even in this chilly reception, Nicole's trained eye caught what she was looking for. A middle-aged man with an overly cheerful smile handed a small package to a younger woman, barely more than a girl. The girl looked hesitant, her eyes darting around as if she was afraid of being seen. Nicole watched the brief exchange carefully, noting how quickly the man disappeared after the transaction. This wasn't the first such interaction she had witnessed, and it wouldn't be the last. Something was happening in this market, something bigger than it seemed on the surface. But what? Nicole knew she had to be careful, watching closely but without drawing attention to herself. Later, as she began to pack up for the day, Thomas finally made his move. He walked over, his boots heavy against the cobblestones, and stood in front of her stall, looking over her display. "Jewelry, huh?" he said, his voice casual but with a clear edge. "That's right," Nicole replied, keeping her tone friendly, though she could sense the tension. "You're new around here? You get a lot of customers today?" His question was innocent enough, but Nicole knew it was a test. "A few," she answered, choosing her words carefully. I guess it'll take time to build up regulars. Thomas smirked, but it wasn't a kind smile. Takes more than time. You've got to be part of this place. These people, they know each other, trust each other. You don't look like someone who's been here long. Nicole met his gaze, unflinching. Everyone has to start somewhere. Sure, he said, though his eyes told a different story, but not everyone stays. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Nicole with the clear message. She was being watched, and she wasn't welcome. As she locked up her stall and prepared to leave for the night, Nicole's mind raced. She had only been here for a day, and already the layers of this place were starting to peel back. The tension in the market wasn't just about her being new. There was something under the surface, a current of fear and suspicion that went beyond simple prejudice. And whatever was happening here, it was bigger than she had anticipated. The next step in her investigation would be even more delicate. She had to gain the trust of the community, but she also had to remain sharp, ready for the danger that lurked beneath the friendly facades and bustling commerce. One wrong move, and her cover would be blown. But Nicole was no stranger to pressure. She was prepared, and she knew that this marketplace, with all its secrets, would eventually crack. As the day came to a close and the marketplace emptied, Nicole's thoughts lingered on Thomas's parting words. Not everyone stays. But she wasn't going anywhere. Not until she uncovered the truth. The next morning, Nicole arrived early to the market, determined to make more headway in her investigation. Her stall was modest compared to the others, but it was her anchor, her way of blending in. Yet she knew from the cold stares she received that blending in was still an uphill battle. As she arranged her display, the faint morning light casting long shadows across the cobblestones, she couldn't help but notice how different things were for the other vendors. Many greeted each other warmly, sharing inside jokes and small talk as they set up their stands. It was a community, but not one that welcomed outsiders, not one that welcomed her. The whispers began again. She didn't need to strain her ears to catch the tone, even if the words weren't clear. It was the same as yesterday: suspicion, doubt, and in some cases, outright rejection. Nicole wasn't oblivious to the dynamics of such a closed-off community. Her job had taken her to many places where tight-knit groups mistrusted outsiders, especially when those outsiders didn't fit the image of what they expected. But here, it was more than just professional detachment. Nicole could feel the weight of prejudice pressing in on her. It wasn't just that she was new. It was that she was different. As the sun rose higher, the market became busier. The smells of freshly baked bread and frying food filled the air, and the crowd of customers started to grow. Nicole remained vigilant, watching the interactions around her. She needed to get closer to the vendors, to learn who was part of the hidden network she was investigating. But the wall of distrust around her seemed impossible to break through. Then there was Thomas. He hadn't said a word to her today, but she could feel his presence. He was watching her again from across the market, his expression unreadable. There was something about him that piqued her curiosity. He was respected in the market. That much was clear. The other vendors greeted him warmly, and even the younger ones looked to him for guidance. But he hadn't exactly been friendly to her. Yesterday's encounter had been civil, but Nicole could sense the layers of skepticism beneath his words. The hours passed slowly, and while Nicole made a few sales, most of the customers avoided her stall. The vendors she tried to talk to responded with curt answers if they responded at all. They didn't trust her. She didn't belong. She knew she had to change that if she was going to uncover anything about the disappearances. It wasn't until midday that Nicole noticed something strange. A man in his early 30s, with a worn leather jacket and dark, watchful eyes, was hovering near the edge of the market. He wasn't browsing the stalls like a normal customer, nor was he interacting with any of the vendors. He seemed to be observing, just like she was. Nicole's instincts kicked in. She watched him from the corner of her eye, pretending to busy herself with rearranging her display. Every few minutes, the man's gaze shifted toward different vendors, lingering on some longer than others. And then, without warning, he moved toward Thomas's stall. Thomas greeted the man with a nod, but there was no warmth in the exchange. The man leaned in close, speaking to Thomas in low, hurried tones. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't casual. Nicole strained to hear, but the noise of the market made it impossible to catch more than a few muffled words. Still, the body language was unmistakable. Thomas was tense, his jaw clenched as he listened. And then, just as quickly as the man had approached, he disappeared back into the crowd. Nicole's mind raced. What was that about? Was Thomas involved in the network? Or was the man warning him about something else? Her gut told her this was a piece of the puzzle, but without more information, it was impossible to say how it all fit together. Just as she was processing the interaction, a shadow fell over her stall. Nicole looked up to see an older vendor, a woman with graying hair and a stern expression, standing in front of her. The woman didn't smile. "Not many people stopping by, huh?" she said, her tone somewhere between pity and condescension. Nicole smiled, trying to keep the interaction light. "Still getting the hang of things. I'm sure it'll pick up." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Maybe. But people around here like to stick with what they know." There it was again, the underlying message that Nicole didn't belong. The woman didn't even try to hide it. Nicole was an outsider, and as far as the market community was concerned, outsiders weren't to be trusted. "I've noticed," Nicole replied evenly. "But I've always believed you can earn trust if you work hard enough." The woman snorted, crossing her arms over her chest. "Trust is a tricky thing, especially in a place like this. People think they know each other, but sometimes, well, let's just say, not everything is as it seems." Nicole's pulse quickened. Was this woman giving her a warning? Or was she just speaking in generalities? Either way, the words struck a chord. Before Nicole could respond, the woman turned to leave, but not before delivering one final remark over her shoulder. "Be careful who you talk to. Some people around here don't like new faces." Nicole watched the woman disappear into the crowd, her heart pounding. Was that a threat, or was it a piece of advice? Either way, it was clear that someone had noticed her presence. She was no longer just an anonymous vendor, blending into the background. People were talking about her, watching her. The wall of distrust wasn't just in her imagination. It was real, and it was closing in around her. That evening, as Nicole packed up her stall, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The man who had spoken to Thomas, the older woman's cryptic words, the growing suspicion from the other vendors, it all pointed to something deeper, something more dangerous than she had initially thought. She had come here to investigate disappearances, but now it seemed like she was the one who was being watched. Thomas passed by her stall as she was locking up, his expression still unreadable. He paused for a moment as if considering whether or not to speak to her again. For a brief second, their eyes met, and Nicole saw something flicker behind his guarded exterior. Was it doubt, curiosity, or something else? "See you tomorrow," he said finally, his voice flat but not unfriendly. "Yeah," Nicole replied, her gaze steady. "See you tomorrow." As Thomas walked away, Nicole felt a mixture of frustration and determination. The wall between her and the market community was strong, but it wasn't impenetrable. She just had to find the right way to break through. She had no choice. The truth was buried somewhere in this marketplace, hidden behind layers of prejudice, mistrust, and fear. And Nicole was determined to find it, no matter how high the walls were built around her. As the days passed, the feeling of being watched grew more intense. Nicole knew that time was slipping through her fingers. Each morning, the marketplace swelled with life, yet within the crowds, an undercurrent of something far darker pulsed beneath the surface. She could sense it in the quick glances between certain vendors, the whispered conversations that stopped as soon as she approached, and the subtle exchanges between buyers and sellers that seemed anything but ordinary. Her investigation was beginning to yield fragments of the truth, but the pieces weren't fitting together yet. Every clue felt like it led to another question, and the more she observed, the more she realized how deeply this hidden operation ran. The disappearances weren't random. They were connected, and the market was the perfect cover. A place bustling with activity, where no one would think twice about people coming and going. Nicole hadn't expected it to be easy, but the walls of mistrust around her were higher than she had anticipated. Even as she made more attempts to blend in, to make casual conversations with the other vendors, They kept their distance. They weren't just skeptical anymore. They were protective. It was as if they were guarding something, and Nicole had a growing suspicion that many of them knew more than they were letting on. Thomas was still an enigma. His behavior toward her hadn't changed much since their first encounter. He kept his distance, but she often caught him watching her. His expression conflicted. She couldn't decide if he was trying to figure her out or if he was hiding something. He was clearly respected in the market, a kind of unofficial leader, and that made him an important player in this investigation. Nicole needed to get closer to him, but so far every attempt had been met with polite indifference. Then, one afternoon, everything shifted. It was a Wednesday, the middle of the week, when the market was usually a little quieter. Nicole was at her stall, meticulously polishing a bracelet as she kept an eye on the comings and goings of the vendors around her. Thomas was at his stall, carving a new piece of wood, his focus seemingly unbreakable. But then she saw it. A man she hadn't seen before approached Thomas, moving with the deliberate ease of someone who wasn't trying to be noticed. Nicole recognized the man immediately. It was the same one who had spoken to Thomas days before, the one with the worn leather jacket and the too quiet demeanor. She watched carefully as the two men exchanged a few brief words. This time, though, their interaction was different. Thomas didn't look tense like before. He looked angry. His jaw was set, his hands clenched around the carving knife he held. The man said something, and Thomas shook his head, a gesture of firm refusal. The stranger's expression darkened, and without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the maze of the market. Thomas stood there for a moment, his body rigid with frustration, before he slammed the carving knife down on the table, hard enough to split the wood beneath it. Nicole's heart raced. Something had changed. Thomas was involved, whether directly or indirectly, she didn't know yet. But whatever was happening, he was no longer just a passive participant. That evening, as the market began to wind down, Nicole made her move. She waited until most of the vendors had packed up and left before approaching Thomas, her pulse quickening as she walked toward him. He was still at his stall, his movements slower than usual, as if the weight of whatever had happened earlier was still pressing down on him. "Thomas," she called out softly, her voice calm but firm. He looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he saw her approach. "What do you want?" he asked, not unkindly, but there was a tiredness in his voice that hadn't been there before. Nicole didn't bother with pleasantries. She knew this wasn't the time for subtlety. "I saw what happened earlier. Who was that man?" For a moment, Thomas didn't respond. His eyes searched hers, and for the first time, Nicole saw a crack in his usual guarded expression. There was fear there. Fear and something else, something closer to regret. "None of your business," he said finally, turning away from her as he continued packing up his stall. Nicole stepped closer, lowering her voice so no one else could hear. "It is my business, Thomas. I know something is going on in this market. People have been disappearing, and I know it's connected to the vendors here. That man, he's part of it, isn't he?" Thomas froze, his back to her. For a long, tense moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned to face her, his eyes hard. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. Nicole didn't back down. "I know enough. I know that you've been involved in something you don't agree with, something that's weighing on you. I've seen the way you look at some of the other vendors, the way you hesitated with that man today. You're not like them, Thomas. But you're afraid, and I need to know why." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, Nicole thought he might shut down completely. But then, to her surprise, he let out a long, frustrated breath and ran a hand through his hair. "It's not that simple," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Make it simple," Nicole pressed gently. "Tell me what's going on." Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with a turmoil of emotions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "It's not just one person, you know. It's a network. They recruit people. People who are struggling, desperate. They make promises, offer money, shelter, work, but it's all a lie. Once they're in, they can't get out. They're trapped." Nicole's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected as much, but hearing Thomas confirm it made it all the more real. "And you're part of this?" Thomas shook his head vehemently. No, not anymore. I didn't know at first. I thought it was just about helping people get on their feet, giving them opportunities. But when I realized what they were really doing, his voice trailed off, and he looked away, shame clouding his features. You tried to leave, Nicole said quietly, piecing it together. He nodded. I did. But once you're in, you don't just walk away. They don't let you. They've got eyes everywhere. If you try to back out, they come after you. And they make sure you know the consequences. Nicole felt a chill run down her spine. This was bigger than she had thought, much bigger. And that man today? She asked. Thomas's face darkened. He's one of them. He wanted me to get back in, to help them with another transaction. But I refused. Nicole's heart raced. What kind of transaction? Thomas hesitated, and then in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, They're planning to move someone tonight. Someone who doesn't know what's coming. Nicole's stomach dropped. The urgency of the situation hit her like a freight train. She had to act, and fast. If someone was being moved tonight, there was no time to waste. I need your help, Thomas, Nicole said, her voice firm. If we're going to stop this, I need you to trust me. For a long moment, Thomas just stared at her, as if weighing his options. Finally, with a resigned sigh, he nodded. All right, he said. But if we're going to do this, we need to be careful. They're dangerous, and they don't play by the rules. Nicole nodded, her mind already racing with plans. We'll do it carefully, but we have to stop them. As the sun set and the market emptied, Nicole and Thomas began their quiet preparations. The hidden truths of the marketplace were about to come to light, and neither of them knew what the consequences would be. But one thing was certain. Nicole was no longer just investigating. She was about to go head-to-head with a network of dangerous individuals, and the stakes had never been higher. The market felt different that morning. Nicole could sense the change in the air, though outwardly, everything seemed the same. The usual vendors were setting up their stalls, the hum of early morning conversations buzzed around her, and the smell of freshly baked bread and roasted coffee filled the air. But today, there was a palpable tension lurking beneath the surface, a quiet storm brewing that no one else seemed to notice, or at least no one was willing to acknowledge. Thomas had been unusually quiet since their conversation the previous night. He kept to his stall, carving another one of his intricate wooden figures, but his movements were slower, more deliberate. Nicole knew he was struggling with the decision he had made to help her. He was putting himself at risk, and they both knew it. If the network suspected him of betraying them, the consequences would be severe. But there was no turning back now. Nicole's focus was singular. Stop the transaction tonight, and in doing so, start dismantling the network that had embedded itself so deeply within this community. Yet, the path forward was fraught with danger. She had to tread carefully. One wrong move, and not only could the mission fail, but she and Thomas could end up in more danger than they could handle. As the market became busier with the usual morning crowd, Nicole kept a close eye on the vendors who had raised her suspicions. Several of them were part of the same tight-knit group, always talking in hushed tones, always darting quick glances in her direction. But there was one in particular she had her sights on today, Jared, a vendor who sold exotic fruits from far-off places. He was well-liked by many, always charming with his customers, but Nicole had noticed something about his transactions. There was an odd pattern to them, especially with the type of people who interacted with him. Those who seemed down on their luck, struggling, and often nervous. He fit the profile of someone involved in the network. Nicole had made a decision. She would tail him after the market closed, hoping it would lead her to the final piece of the puzzle she needed. Thomas had warned her that Jared was one of the main points of contact for the network, someone who could be trusted to move people from place to place without drawing attention. The idea that such a well-liked figure could be part of something so insidious made Nicole's stomach turn. But Jared wasn't the only concern. The entire market seemed to be on edge today, as if the vendors themselves sensed something was wrong. Nicole had overheard snippets of conversations, some of them about her, others about the market itself. People were beginning to notice the cracks in their seemingly perfect little world. The gossip about Nicole's presence had become more blatant. It wasn't just subtle whispers anymore. She could feel the eyes on her, hear the mutterings as she passed by. "She doesn't belong here," one woman said loudly to a fellow vendor, her voice dripping with disdain as Nicole walked by. Another man from a few stalls down muttered, "She's up to something. Mark my words." Nicole kept her expression neutral, but inside, the tension was rising. She couldn't afford to become a target, not now. The closer she got to uncovering the truth, the more dangerous this was becoming. And if people started to turn on her, it could blow her cover, putting the entire operation at risk. By midday, she received the first real sign that things were beginning to spiral out of control. A man she didn't recognize, grizzled, with a face hardened by years of distrust, approached her stall. He didn't look like the usual customers who came for her handmade jewelry. His presence was heavy, and he stood too close, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that set off alarm bells in her mind. "You're not from around here, are you?" he said, his voice low but menacing. Nicole smiled politely, masking the unease that crept up her spine. "Just trying to make a living, same as everyone else." He didn't smile back. "Yeah, but you don't really fit in, do you?" Nicole's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "It takes time to get to know people." The man's gaze was piercing, unrelenting. "People around here talk. You should be careful about who you get close to. Some of us don't take kindly to strangers poking their noses where they don't belong." Nicole held his gaze, refusing to back down. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, her voice firm. With that, the man gave her a final unsettling look before turning and walking away. Nicole exhaled slowly, her mind racing. It was a warning, plain and simple. The network was onto her. Someone must have noticed her paying too much attention to certain vendors, or perhaps they had seen her and Thomas talking more frequently. Either way, the noose was tightening, and she knew she had to move fast. That evening, as the market began to close down for the day, Nicole kept a low profile. She packed up her stall with practiced ease, making sure not to draw any unnecessary attention. The transaction was supposed to happen tonight, and she needed to be ready. Thomas was waiting for her near the back alley behind his stall, his face grim. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Once we go in, there's no backing out." Nicole nodded. "I'm sure. We have to stop this." Thomas glanced around, as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "Jared's involved, but he's just one part of it. There's someone else pulling the strings. Someone higher up. We haven't found them yet." Nicole had suspected as much. Jared was the middleman, but the real power was still lurking in the shadows. Whoever it was, they were smart enough to stay hidden even as the network expanded its reach. But for tonight, stopping the transaction was their priority. They had to get the victim to safety before they were moved to a location where they could disappear forever. Together, Nicole and Thomas made their way through the narrow alleyways that wound behind the market. The sun had long since set, casting deep shadows over the brick walls and cobblestone streets. The air was cool, and the sounds of the bustling market were replaced by the eerie silence of nightfall. As they approached the back of Jared's stall, Nicole felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was it, the moment where everything could either fall into place or fall apart. She knew the risks, but the thought of doing nothing, of letting another person vanish into the clutches of the network, was unbearable. Thomas signaled for her to stop as they reached a secluded spot behind the stall. There, in the dim light, they could see Jared standing with another man, a lanky figure in a hooded jacket, his face obscured. Between them stood a young woman, barely in her 20s, her face pale with fear. She was fidgeting, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. But Jared had his hand firmly on her arm, preventing her from moving. Nicole's heart pounded in her chest. They were too far to hear the conversation, but the scene was clear. Jared and his accomplice were preparing to move the girl, likely to a waiting vehicle that would take her to whatever fate the network had in store. "We have to do something," Nicole whispered urgently to Thomas. Thomas nodded, his face set with determination. "Follow my lead." Before Nicole could respond, Thomas stepped out of the shadows, his voice calm but commanding. "Jared," he called out. Jared froze, turning to face Thomas with a look of surprise, quickly replaced by annoyance. "What are you doing here, Thomas?" Thomas took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "I need to talk to you." Jared glanced nervously at the girl, then back at Thomas. Now's not a good time. Thomas didn't waver. It's important. Nicole watched from her hiding spot, her heart racing. She knew that this was the moment. If they didn't act now, the girl would be lost. She couldn't let that happen. Summoning all her courage, Nicole stepped out of the shadows and into the dim light. He's not alone, Jared. Jared's eyes widened as he saw Nicole approach. His hand tightened on the girl's arm, and the lanky man beside him shifted nervously. You. Jared spat, his voice filled with venom. I knew you were trouble. Nicole stood her ground. It's over, Jared. Let her go. For a moment, the air was thick with tension. Jared's gaze flicked between Thomas and Nicole, calculating his next move. The girl's eyes filled with silent pleas, her body trembling with fear. And then, with a low growl, Jared released his grip on the girl and shoved her toward Nicole. Take her, he snarled. But this isn't over. Nicole rushed forward, grabbing the girl by the arm and pulling her to safety. Thomas stood beside her, his eyes locked on Jared, who backed away slowly before disappearing into the night. As soon as he was gone, Nicole exhaled, her entire body shaking with the adrenaline of the moment. They had done it. They had saved the girl. But as she looked into Thomas's eyes, she knew this was only the beginning. The real fight was still ahead. The following morning, the marketplace was quiet, eerily so. Normally alive with the bustling of vendors setting up their stalls and the chatter of early shoppers, today it seemed the market was holding its breath. The usual sounds were muted, as though the market itself sensed that something had changed, that something darker was lingering in the air. Nicole had barely slept the night before. After saving the young woman, they had handed her over to the authorities, who were now looking into how deep the network went. The girl had been too frightened to give them much information, but it was enough to confirm what Nicole had already suspected. The market was just a front for something much larger. The operation they had uncovered was only one piece of a far-reaching network that preyed on vulnerable people, exploiting them and making them disappear. But Jared was still out there. And more importantly, the real mastermind, the one who had been pulling the strings all along, had yet to be exposed. Nicole knew that time was running out. The confrontation with Jared had been too public. It wouldn't take long before word spread, and if the network felt the heat, they would either go underground or retaliate. Neither option boded well. Nicole arrived at the market early, her senses on high alert. As she set up her stall, she noticed the vendors were more subdued than usual. Whispers spread through the air like a virus, and Nicole could feel the weight of their suspicion. They knew something was coming, even if they didn't know exactly what. Some of them even avoided looking at her entirely. Their gazes cast downward as they hurried about their business, but others, like Thomas, kept their eyes on her, wary but supportive. She caught sight of Thomas standing by his stall, his face pale and drawn from the stress of the previous night's events. He nodded to her in acknowledgement, and she returned the gesture. They both knew that today could be the day everything came to a head. Nicole's mind raced as she replayed the events of the past few days, trying to piece together the puzzle. Jared had slipped away into the night, but there was no way he could vanish completely. Someone had to be helping him, and it had to be someone with enough power to keep the operation running smoothly, even as cracks began to show. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp voice cutting through the quiet air. You. Nicole looked up to see a small group of vendors gathered a few stalls down. They were glaring at her, their faces twisted in anger and suspicion. The man at the front, an older vendor with graying hair and a sour expression, pointed directly at Nicole. "This is your doing, isn't it?" he shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "You come here, start snooping around, and now everything's falling apart. What are you up to?" The crowd around him murmured in agreement, their whispers growing louder with each passing second. Nicole felt the tension in the air rising, like the quiet before a storm. "I'm just trying to do my job," Nicole said calmly, stepping out from behind her stall. "I'm here to help, not to cause trouble." "Help?" The man spat. "We don't need your kind of help. You've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, and now the market's in danger. People are talking, saying things are going to change, and not for the better." Nicole stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. Things need to change, she said firmly. People have been disappearing. This market isn't as safe as you think it is. There's a network here. People taking advantage of others, exploiting them. The man sneered. You don't know anything about this place. You're an outsider. This market's been here longer than you've been alive. We look after our own. That's the problem, Nicole shot back, her voice rising with emotion. You think by keeping to yourselves, you're protecting something, but you're turning a blind eye to what's really happening. People are getting hurt because no one wants to see the truth. For a moment, there was silence. The crowd seemed to be processing her words, unsure of whether to believe her or not. But before anyone could respond, a new voice cut through the tension, a familiar voice, deep and commanding. She's right. Nicole turned to see Thomas stepping forward, his expression resolute. The crowd parted slightly as he approached, his presence demanding attention. This market isn't what it used to be, he continued, addressing the crowd. We've all seen it. We've all felt it, people disappearing, strange faces coming and going, and we've been ignoring it, pretending it's not our problem. The older vendor who had been confronting Nicole glared at Thomas, his lips curling in disdain. You too? You're siding with her? Thomas held his ground. I'm siding with the truth. What's happening here isn't right. People are being taken advantage of, and we've let it happen. We've let it happen because we didn't want to admit that something was wrong. But it's time to face it. The crowd murmured again, this time more uncertainly. Thomas had a reputation in the market. People respected him. If he was speaking out, it meant something. But there was still resistance, still doubt. Nicole seized the moment. There's more going on here than any of us realized, she said. But we can stop it. We can make this market safe again for everyone. But we need to work together. The older vendor scoffed. And what do you suggest we do, huh? Just turn everything upside down? Before Nicole could respond, a loud voice boomed from the edge of the crowd, silencing everyone. You want to know what we do? Nicole's heart skipped a beat. Jared stepped forward, flanked by two men, both of them imposing and stern-faced. His presence sent a ripple of unease through the gathered vendors. Jared's normally charming demeanor was gone, replaced by something much colder, much more dangerous. We keep things the way they are, Jared said, his voice low but filled with authority. This market runs just fine, and people like you, he pointed at Nicole, have no business coming in here and telling us how to live. Thomas took a step toward Jared, his jaw tight with anger. We know what you're doing, Jared. We know about the network. Jared's eyes narrowed. You don't know anything. But Nicole saw it, the slight flicker of fear in Jared's eyes. He was bluffing. He didn't expect to be confronted, not like this, not in front of the whole market. Nicole's mind raced as she realized they had a chance, a slim one, but a chance nonetheless. If they could expose him now, here, in front of everyone, it could break the network's hold. You're the one who's been moving people, Jared, Nicole said, stepping closer, her voice steady. We have witnesses. People know what you've been doing. You've been exploiting the most vulnerable, promising them help, and then making them disappear. Jared sneered, but Nicole could see the cracks in his facade. The vendors were watching closely now, and the fear in Jared's eyes was growing. You don't have any proof, he said, his voice wavering slightly. You're just making accusations. Nicole felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. We have enough, she said, her voice unwavering. And more is coming. It's over, Jared. For a moment, Jared just stood there, his fists clenched at his sides. Then, without warning, he lunged toward Nicole. But before he could get close, Thomas stepped in, grabbing him by the arm and twisting him to the ground in a swift, practiced move. The crowd gasped, and Nicole quickly called for backup, alerting the authorities who had been stationed nearby in case something like this happened. Within moments, Jared and his accomplices were restrained and taken away. As the crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring in shock and disbelief, Nicole felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. It was over. The network was broken. The marketplace, once clouded by secrecy and corruption, would now have a chance to heal. Thomas walked over to her, his expression somber but relieved. You did it, he said quietly. We did it, Nicole corrected him with a small smile. It's not over yet, though. There's still a lot to uncover, and the network goes deeper than Jared, but this is a start. Thomas nodded, looking out over the market. I guess things are going to change around here. They have to, Nicole said softly, but it'll be for the better. For a moment, they stood in silence, watching as the vendors slowly returned to their stalls, trying to process the events of the morning. There was still uncertainty in the air, still fear of what was to come. But there was also hope. The marketplace, once divided and tainted by secrecy, was beginning to mend. As Nicole gathered her things, preparing to leave the market behind, she turned to Thomas one last time. "Thank you, Thomas, for everything." Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him in days. "You're welcome, and thank you for making me see things differently." Nicole nodded, knowing that their partnership had changed them both. They had faced prejudice, mistrust, and danger, but they had come out stronger, more united in their shared goal. As Nicole walked away from the market, she felt a sense of closure, but also a sense of responsibility. The fight against injustice was far from over, but today they had made a difference. And in the end, that's what mattered. The marketplace would never be the same. But perhaps, in the wake of the reckoning, it could become something better. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.